In a city of iron and fog, a spectacle arrived without warning. No posters announced its coming, and no tickets were sold in advance. It simply appeared. A sprawling labyrinth of monochromatic tents, all striped in charcoal and cream, huddled together behind an ornate gate of wrought iron. This was the Lunar Menagerie, and its existence was the byproduct of a silent, decades-long duel between two masters of the impossible. Elias, a man who moved with the stiffness of a Victorian schoolmaster, had chosen his ward early. He found Kalen in a rain-slicked orphanage, a boy who could make coins vanish not through sleight of hand, but by wishing them out of existence. Across the ocean, in a salon filled with the scent of dried lavender and old ink, a woman known only as the Weaver had taken under her wing a girl named Alara. While Kalen's magic was structural, rooted in the manipulation of physical matter, Alara's was organic, born of illusion and the weaving of light. The rules of their engagement were never spoken, only understood. They were to be the pieces in a game of endurance and imagination. The Lunar Menagerie was their board. Kalen was tasked with the engineering of the circus. He spent years in a basement in Prague, carving the heavy iron clock that stood at the gates. A mechanism so complex that it transformed into a clockwork dragon every hour on the hour, breathing cold white mist. Alara, meanwhile, breathed life into the tents. She created the Garden of Glass, where the flowers were made of spun crystal but smelled of actual jasmine, and the Pool of Tears, where visitors could drop a pebble and see a memory reflected in the ripples. As the menagerie traveled from the docks of Marseille to the hills of Kyoto, the two competitors remained shadows to one another. They communicated through their additions to the circus. Kalen would build a tent of gravity-defying stones. Alara would respond by filling it with clouds that rained soft, edible sparks. It was a conversation held in the language of miracles. However, the game had a flaw. Neither Elias nor the Weaver had accounted for the curiosity of their puppets. During a midsummer night in a coastal village in Spain, Kalen wandered into a tent he hadn't built, a space filled with 1,000 paper birds. As he watched, the birds began to fly, their wings rustling like turning pages. In the center of the whirlwind stood Alara. They did not speak of the duel. Instead, they spoke of the loneliness of being the only two people in the world who understood the weight of the air inside these tents. Their connection was instantaneous and dangerous. The circus, fueled by their combined magical residue, began to grow more vivid, more haunting. But the game was designed to have only one victor, and the energy required to sustain the menagerie was beginning to take a toll on the Morgans, the ordinary performers and staff who lived within the gates, unaware they were living inside a magical furnace. The more Kalen and Alara fell in love, the more the circus thrived, but the more unstable the magic became. The black and white stripes of the tents began to bleed into gray. The iron clock groaned under the pressure of time that wasn't moving correctly. They realized that their masters had not intended for a stalemate, and as long as they both lived and competed, the circus would eventually consume itself and everyone within it. The pressure mounted as the menagerie reached the cliffs of Scotland. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and burnt sugar. Elias and the Weaver watched from the periphery, cold and expectant, waiting for one of their students to falter, to be absorbed by the other's power. But Kalen and Alara were no longer interested in winning. They were interested in survival, not just their own, but the survival of the dream they had built together. They began to plot a way to bind themselves to the circus permanently, to remove the need for the duel by becoming the very foundation of the tents. It was a sacrifice that would strip them of their physical forms but grant them an eternity within the world they had created. As the sun began to set over the jagged Scottish coastline, Kalen met Alara in the heart of the menagerie, beneath the great central bonfire that burned with a flame that never gave off heat. The duel was reaching its tipping point. The magic was fraying at the edges, and the shadows were beginning to move independently of the light. They took each other's hands, the structural mage and the weaver of light, and prepared to rewrite the rules of a game they never asked to play. The transition was not a death, but a diffusion. As Kalen and Alara surrendered their physical shells, the energy of the lunar menagerie shifted. The violent, erratic pulses of magic smoothed into a steady, rhythmic hum, the heartbeat of the circus itself. To the visitors, nothing seemed to have changed. The popcorn still tasted of caramel and salt, and the acrobats still swung from silken ribbons without nets. But for those who lived within the striped canvas walls, the atmosphere felt lighter. The Morgans no longer woke up with the phantom aches of a power they couldn't control. The circus was no longer a battlefield. It was an ecosystem. Elias and the Weaver found themselves standing outside the gates, unable to enter. The wrought iron bars, once their gateway to influence, were now cold and impassable. Their players had left the board, taking the board with them. The masters had lost their puppets, and in doing so had lost their relevance. They faded into the gray fog of the city, two old ghosts with no one left to haunt. Inside, the menagerie continued its eternal tour. It appeared in the center of a desert, then on the outskirts of a frozen Siberian town. It followed no map, guided only by the whims of the two spirits who now inhabited the very air of the tents. Kalen was the structure, the way the tents stayed upright against the gale, the way the paths always led a visitor exactly where they needed to go. Alara was the soul, the silver light that bathed the grounds, the impossible sense, and the dreams that visitors carried home in their pockets. They found ways to manifest for each other. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn when the last guest had departed, two figures could be seen walking near the labyrinth of mirrors. They were translucent, shimmering like heat haze, but their hands were joined. They had found a way to be together that transcended the physical, turning their cage into a sanctuary. The circus gained a legendary status. Secret societies, calling themselves the Lunatics, formed to track its appearances. They dressed in charcoal suits with cream-colored scarves, waiting at train stations and harbor docks for the scent of wood smoke and cinnamon that heralded the menagerie's arrival. They told stories of the tent of lost orbits, where you could walk among the stars, and the gallery of frozen time, where a single moment of happiness could be relived for as long as one could hold their breath. But the most famous attraction remained the Memorial of Embers. In the center of the circus sat a small, unassuming tent. Inside, there were no illusions, only a single candle that never burned down. Beside it lay a notebook where visitors could write messages to those they had lost. It was said that if you wrote a name in the book, you would feel a sudden warmth, as if someone had placed a kind hand on your shoulder. As decades turned into a century, the world outside the gates changed. Cities grew taller, the air grew thicker with the noise of engines, and the magic of the old world began to retreat into the shadows. Yet the lunar menagerie remained untouched by time. It was a pocket of the past, preserved by a love that had been forged in the fires of a cruel competition. The performers stayed young, or perhaps they simply aged so slowly that no one noticed. The children of the circus grew up learning to walk on air and speak to the wind, raised by a community that existed outside the boundaries of any nation. They were the citizens of the stripes, the keepers of the flame. In the end, the story of the circus was not about the magic itself, but about the choice to protect it. Kalen and Alara had transformed a game of destruction into a legacy of wonder. They remained the silent conductors of the symphony, ensuring that for as long as there were people who dreamt of the impossible, there would be a place where those dreams could take root. And so the gates would open again tonight. The iron dragon would breathe its mist, the glass flowers would bloom in the dark, and somewhere in the crowd, a girl in a charcoal coat would feel a soft breeze whisper a secret in her ear, reminding her that even in a world of iron and fog, there is still room for the extraordinary. The lunar menagerie was open, and the stars were just beginning to align. As the years bled into a second century, the lunar menagerie became more than a traveling show. It became a living myth, a ghost ship of the land that sailed on the tides of human imagination. Within the charcoal and cream walls, the transition of Kalen and Alara into the circus's fundamental essence had created a strange, beautiful stasis. They were the architects of a reality where gravity was a suggestion and time was a liquid. While the world outside transitioned into an era of neon and silicon, the menagerie remained a sanctuary of velvet, steam, and starlight. The internal hierarchy of the circus evolved. A young woman named Serafina, born to a trapeze artist and a fortune teller within the confines of the gates, became the new conductor. She did not possess the raw, world-altering power of the founders, but she could hear the circus breathing. She could feel Kalen's presence in the tension of the tent ropes and Alara's spirit in the way the lanterns flickered to greet a lonely guest. Serafina's role was to be the bridge between the ethereal masters and the physical performers, ensuring the delicate balance of the Morgans was maintained. New wonders began to manifest as the bond between Kalen and Alara deepened in their incorporeal state. There was the tent of whispered cartography, where the floor was a giant, shifting map made of sand. As you walked across it, the sand would rise to form the mountains and valleys of your own past, allowing you to walk through the geography of your memories. There was the Cloudcatcher's atrium, where the ceiling was open to the sky, yet no rain ever fell. Instead, the clouds would descend in soft, solid pillows for guests to sit upon while they watched silent films projected onto the smoke of the central bonfire. The duel, though long over, left a lingering resonance that occasionally attracted those who sought power. In the mid-1900s, a group of occultists tried to anchor the circus in a single location, hoping to harvest the infinite energy Kalen and Alara generated. They cornered the menagerie in a valley in the Swiss Alps, surrounding the perimeter with leaden seals. But the circus was no longer a physical entity that could be trapped. That night, the tents didn't just pack up. They dissolved into a murder of paper crows, reassembling themselves at dawn on a beach in Brazil. The occultists were left with nothing but a handful of black and white feathers and the scent of burnt sugar. The relationship between the lunatics, the devoted followers outside the gates, and the circus intensified. They began to leave tributes at the gates: silver keys, handwritten poems, and clockwork gears. These items would vanish by morning, absorbed into the menagerie's ever-growing collection of curiosities. It was rumored that if you gave the circus something you truly loved, the circus would give you a night where you could speak to the dead. One evening, under a blood-red moon in the American Southwest, a descendant of the Weaver appeared at the gates. He was a man named Julian, carrying an old, leather-bound journal that contained the original notes for the duel. He sought to finish the game, believing that Alara had been defeated and absorbed rather than choosing her fate. He entered the Garden of Glass, intending to shatter the illusions and reclaim the power for his bloodline. But the menagerie was no longer a collection of spells. It was a consciousness. As Julian raised his hand to strike at the crystal flora, the garden didn't break, changed. The glass flowers turned into mirrors, reflecting not Julian's face, but the faces of everyone who had ever found joy within the circus. He saw the wonder of children, the peace of the elderly, and the shared glances of lovers. He saw the weight of the beauty Kalen and Alara had protected. The sheer scale of their sacrifice and their creation overwhelmed him. He didn't destroy the garden. He sat in the center of it and wept until the sun rose, at which point he walked out of the gates and never looked back, leaving the journal behind on a bench. The journal was found by Serafina, who brought it to the central bonfire. As the pages caught fire, the flames turned a brilliant, searing white. For a moment, the silhouettes of a man and a woman appeared in the smoke, dancing. It was the first time in decades they had been so visible. The circus hummed in a key of pure gold, a vibration of gratitude that shook the earth for miles. As the 21st century dawned, the menagerie faced its greatest challenge, a world that had stopped believing in magic. People were distracted by screens. They no longer looked at the horizon for the arrival of striped tents. The lunatics were aging, and the stories were fading into digital noise. To survive, the circus had to adapt once more. It began to appear in the most unlikely places: abandoned shopping malls, the rooftops of skyscrapers, and the middle of bustling city squares during the lunch hour. It became a pop-up miracle, a glitch in the modern matrix. Those who stepped inside found something they didn't know they were missing: silence. The tent of the deep sea became a favorite, where one could walk on the ocean floor without breathing apparatus, watching bioluminescent fish drift past while the roar of the city above was replaced by the rhythmic thrum of the Earth's heart. Kalen and Alara grew more refined in their expressions. Kalen began to manipulate the very atoms of the circus, creating structures that were impossible by any law of physics. Tents that were larger on the inside than the outside, and staircases that led to different seasons. Alara began to weave emotions directly into the atmosphere. You didn't just see the colors, you felt them. A blue tent made you feel the tranquility of a summer afternoon. A red tent sparked the fire of lost ambitions. The legacy of the lunar menagerie became a testament to the idea that art and love are the only things that truly endure. The circus was a living museum of the human spirit. Even as the Morgans eventually passed away, new dreamers were always drawn to the gates, invited by a shimmering invitation that appeared under their pillows or in the margins of their favorite books. The circus never lacked for a family. It created one out of the displaced and the starry-eyed. In the final years of the story, the menagerie prepared for its most ambitious journey. It was no longer bound to the earth. On a night when the stars seemed particularly close, the iron clock at the gate struck 13. The wrought iron gates didn't open outward. They opened upward. The tents didn't fold. They stretched, turning into pillars of light that reached toward the cosmos. The lunar menagerie took flight, becoming a constellation of its own. It became a destination for the dreamers of the entire universe, a place where the stripes were made of dark matter and silver dust. Kalen and Alara, finally and completely unified, steered their creation through the great unknown. They were no longer the players or the pieces. They were the game itself, and the game was infinite. Back on Earth, the legend persisted. Every now and then, on a particularly clear night, someone would look up and see a flicker of charcoal and cream against the velvet black of space. They would smell a faint trace of caramel and wood smoke on the wind, and for a moment, they would remember how to wonder. The circus hadn't left. It had simply expanded its borders. And somewhere, in the heart of that celestial carnival, two shadows held hands, watching the lights of 1,000 worlds twinkle below them, content in the knowledge that the show would always go on.